Hello to everyone, and we are very glad to have you for this extremely important discussion, a bit different than what we expected when about 6 weeks ago, when we thought that the Israeli attack on had not only in the current situation, but to yet another country, which we'll be discussing, that would all have happened, and it hasn't. But we have so much to do, and let us get to it. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to thank our UCLA co-sponsors, International Institute and Luskin Department of Public Policy. Before we begin, whoever runs these sessions has to tell you the following important information. If you've heard it before in some of our discussions, I'll try to make it as quickly as possible. While you see us, we cannot see or hear you. We are recording the presentation today, and the video will be available on the CMed website, YouTube, and our Facebook page as soon as possible. If you are joining us using Zoom, please notice the chat window at the bottom of the screen. We will share announcements during the talk with you here. However, you will not be able to add comments in the chat box. If you have questions for our speakers, please type them in the Q&A window also at the bottom of your screen. So again, there's the chat box, but if you want to ask questions, which we are always trying to take as many as possible, then you go to the Q&A window, also at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to include your name and your country and or affiliation. If we don't have some information about you, we can't have the question. Many people prefer to hear something about the individual who has asked the question. And note that your name name, country, and or affiliation will be announced aloud along with your question. Only the CMed team will be able to see your questions. In some cases, we will answer questions in writing in the Q&A window for others to see. Please keep questions concise so we can answer as many questions as possible. If you are joining us on the YouTube platform, please note you will not be able to ask a question because comments will be disabled. That's on the YouTube platform, so all of you know to start. Now, these are difficult times, and times where the press, as you will see, may not be entirely correct, and they certainly don't know about the history that our team knows today. Our first speaker is Dr. Bijan Kajapur. He is a managing partner at Eurasian Nexus Partners, a Vienna-based international consulting firm with a focus on West Asia, and has been recognized as a leading commentator on Iranian political and economic developments. And I know him. Believe me, he is. His research work has focused on issues including Iran's energy sector, the country's rentier economy, and the impact of corruption and mismanagement on economic development. So interesting. Dr. Kajapur is also a member of the board of the European Middle East Research Group and a regular contributor to Amouage and Al-Monitor. He has also contributed to a number of books on the region. Dr. Kajapur completed his graduate studies in management and economy in Germany and the UK, and his DBA at the International School of Management in Paris. So, Bijan, you're on.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm
I look forward. Let me start by commenting about the domestic dynamics in Iran because it's an important element in our assessment, and then I will move also a little bit to the regional dynamics. I'm sure the other contributors can cover the external aspects much better than I can, but let me start with the domestic dynamics. We all know that Iran has had a moderate reformist president for the past few months, President Pezeshkian, and he ran and also he won the election on the slogan of national unity. And this national unity, if it means that there is a larger degree of alignment and cohesion between the different centers of power, is actually working quite well. I mean, we can see that in a number of phenomena, including for example, releases of political prisoners, a few adjustments to some social and domestic laws, and so on. And there are two interpretations of why this level of alignment is happening. The optimistic one talks about the fact that Pezeshkian is essentially implementing the consensus of the top leadership, and there is a growing realization among the political elite in Iran that the regime as a political entity needs to reconcile itself with the society after the recent upheavals and political protests and so on. And hence the relaxation of a number of laws and the de-escalation, the domestic de-escalation. The pessimistic interpretation is this is just a short-lived honeymoon between the hardliners or those who have power in Iran and the President Pezeshkian. And after a few months, things will turn again, and the more hardline elements will try to dominate the domestic scene. We can obviously have our own assessment of what the main reasons are, but the reality usually in Iran is somewhere in between. I really think that there is a degree of reassessment of domestic policies in the top leadership in Iran, including a supreme leader. There is definitely a realization that one needs to pay more attention to what the society wants. And it's not a coincidence that President Pezeshkian's initial initiatives focus on, for example, removing some of the restrictions on internet access and removing some restriction on social aspects, re-legitimizing some of the university professors and students who had been sacked during the former administration, President Raisi administration, and really making some adjustments within domestic realities. And I think that's an important aspect, especially if we think about the fact that there are no external tensions and potentially external escalation because of the regional situation, in which case Iran would definitely need the domestic de-escalation. But before I move to the regional picture or external picture, let me also mention that through the demise of the former president, President Raisi, one important aspect domestically was also that the presidency was completely decoupled from the question of succession to the supreme leader. Some of you may remember that President Raisi himself was considered a candidate to succeed Ayatollah Khamenei as the supreme leader. And obviously his demise and the fact that a non-cleric was elected as the new president has decoupled these two. That doesn't mean that the succession aspect is not a priority anymore. In fact, the competition is ongoing. And in a very interesting realization, two of the top candidates for succession, one was Ibrahim Raisi And in some circles, one was also Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who was assassinated or killed by Israel. Two of the top potential candidates for succession are not there anymore. That means that potentially new faces will emerge. If we have time, we can always go into that discussion. But it's a very interesting competition, and it will definitely have an impact on how Iran will position itself and how Iran will approach a number of key strategic questions, including potential engagement of Western governments about the nuclear issue. President Pezeshkian actually ran on this premise that Iran will try to engage the Western governments to renegotiate the nuclear deal. And obviously, all of these things are heavily overshadowed by the current escalation or current tensions between Iran and Israel. Now, obviously, the key question is, will the situation lead to a regional escalation and regional war? Fact is that Iran, the current constellation of power in Iran, is not looking for an escalation, is not looking for an all-out war. One can sit and sort of speculate about the reasons why Iran does not want it, but essentially it's definitely something that will completely derail developments in the country, that will completely undermine the developments in Iran. And Iran's analysis is that a regional escalation, a potential confrontation between Iran and Israel will eventually lead to a potential military confrontation between Iran and the US, and that's definitely not something that Tehran wants. But as we know, in this question, Iran is not in the driver's seat. What Israel has been doing in Gaza and also now in Lebanon over the past few weeks is the determinant factor. And in many assessments, many believe that Iran's attack, the most recent attack on Israel, was more an attempt to prevent a potential Israeli attack by drawing new deterrence lines with Iran's missile capability. Whether it has worked or not, I'm sure we can discuss, but the Iranians, the statement from Iran is very clear. We are not afraid of a war, but we do not want a war. This is important to understand. And in fact, the regaining of power by the reformist and moderate forces in Iran also means that one of the two schools of thought on foreign policy have taken over or are dominating the discussion, and that is the conciliatory approach. I have always argued that the Iranian political elite is divided into two approaches. One I always call the confrontational approach. That is definitely the more hardline elements, the more arch-conservative elements in Iran who believe that the only way to secure Iran's rights is through confrontation. But the second school of thought is conciliatory, is the same one that made the JCPOA possible in the 2013 to 2015 period when it was negotiated. And that very same school of thought is back in power, is conciliatory. And you can see that in some of the diplomatic moves that are emerging in the new government. Iran has been investing a lot of time and also effort into deepening ties with immediate neighbors, with the region. Over the past couple of days, the Iranian foreign minister was in Bahrain and then in Cairo, two states that would have not necessarily been on the list of diplomatic exchanges from Tehran's perspective. But the current situation means that Iran wants to deepen ties with immediate neighbors and is open to some sort of a de-escalation with the international powers. But a lot will definitely depend on Israel's next move and whether that will elicit another response from Iran, hence leading to a regional escalation. So it's a tense period, it's uncertain, but it's important to understand that we have a group in Iran, or we have a constellation of power that is looking for conciliatory paths rather than confrontational paths. I'll stop there. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bijan. We'll be discussing this more in a few minutes. But meanwhile, we're moving now to Mr. Matthew McInnes, who has been a senior fellow at the Institute for the Study of War and has just become, or should I say, is in the process of becoming a U.S. official. Matt is a close friend, and now we have to think of him a little bit differently, especially when it comes to trying to find out information. But he has previously served as the Deputy Special Representative for Iran and as a member of policy planning at the U.S. Department of State. He was also a resident fellow at American Enterprise Institute in Foreign and Defense Policy after serving for 15 years in the Department of Defense as an intelligence officer and advisor on Middle East, China, and non-proliferation issues. He sometimes seems to be able to talk about everything. We'll hear what he has to say today. Matt.
Thanks, Steve. And it's great to be back with our UCLA CMed crew. Always good to have a conversation on these topics. As Steve mentioned, I'm actually this week in the process of transitioning back into the U.S. government. So I'm going to be a special advisor to both the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and continuing to support, at least for a while, U.S. Central Command in these issues as I continue to focus on China and Middle East concerns. So for those of you want to hit me up on questions on China as well, that would be great, and happy to field those as best I can. But of course, I have to caveat everything I'm saying now as obviously my views or my personal views. They do not represent those of the U.S. government, but I hope we can still have a productive conversation today. So just building on some of the comments that Bijan has made, I think, we're ever since October 7th of last year, we're in this period of changing risk calculations and red lines where we are seeing all sides take greater leaps and push their boundaries of what has been acceptable in the contest between Iran and Israel and Iran's proxies and partner groups, as well as certainly the risks that Israel is willing to take, the ability for Israel to conduct a very extended conflict. This is, obviously the longest conflict that Israel has been involved in a hot war sense. And so, we're seeing all sides being tested. And it's one of the things that is important to note that, that we are seeing that the escalation ladder can still go up. At the same time, we are not hitting that regional war, which I don't think anyone really wants. Certainly the U.S. government does not want that. The Iranians do not want that. I can't speak for Israel, but I certainly don't think Israel wants the full wider war, but at the same time, they are certainly trying to restore deterrence and push back against Hamas, Hezbollah, and other groups that are closely aligned, if not attached to Iran and the Islamic Republic there. So, we're in this new world. We have certainly seen Iran also push new boundaries in response from the attacks in April of this year, and then more recently at the beginning of this month. I still think that both sides do want to restrain from a regional conflict, but as Bijan has indicated, Israel is retaining escalation dominance in this situation, and I think the U.S. kind of recognizes that Israel holds the upper hand here. I think that's understandable, at least in certainly in the short term. One of the things that's always been interesting about kind of the Iran's contest with the West, is the willingness, as much as Iran wants to avoid the direct conventional conflict, it's willing to engage in a very long-term unconventional conflict with both the U.S. and with Israel, and to a lesser degree, certain Arab states over the years. And we're seeing all of that being tested at this point in time, and the ability, the expectation that Iran holds a certain upper hand in that regard, because either the U.S. or Israel, others do not want to engage in long war, or not, at least not willing to, or not capable of. And I think that's being disproven at this point. That certainly the U.S. can, and as we've seen, engage in more extended support for activities here in the region. And certainly Israel has been willing to engage in conflict for quite some time, since last year. So I think a lot of things are being rethought at this point. And of course, the big impact and the big questions that everyone has is, how will the election impact this? How will a potential change in administration, how is that factoring into everyone's calculations? I think, to the degree that I can speak to this, I think it's important to recognize that no side really understands how this is going to evolve, and so I think this is it's important from even from a policy perspective from either the Harris or the Trump teams, and frankly, even the remaining time for the Biden administration, is that things are evolving very quickly. And so that's making it very difficult, I think, in my opinion, to formulate what the policy is going to be for either administration after January. And I think that's going to be a real difficulty as we look towards all sides trying to calculate what is going to happen in the next few weeks, in the next couple of months, and into the next year. And I think that's going to feed a lot of uncertainty that will further kind of complicate the situation in the region. My expectation and hope, frankly, is that uncertainty is actually going to aid in trying to keep things relatively contained. I mean, they're certainly not in a broad sense contained at this point, but that the more dramatic escalation that folks are worried about is going to be tempered by the fact that we're going to enter into a new equation on the U.S. domestic side in the coming months. And I think everyone is trying to think through what do we need, what kind of position that we need to be in when that happens. And I think that is really the motivating factor for multiple sides here. And with that, I'll pause, and I look forward to your questions.
And now we come to our last speaker, Robin Wright, who is so well known to most of you for her articles and her appearances on TV and the like. Let me describe, for those of you who don't know her, and then say one or two things before I turn this over. She's a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. She's reported from more than 140 countries for the New Yorker. 140 countries, you heard that. And she's worked for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, Time, the NYT Magazine, LA Times, among others. She has also been a fellow at the Brookings Institution, Carnegie Endowment for National Peace, Yale, Duke, Stanford, Dartmouth, and the University of California up north. We've got to bring her down. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the UN Correspondents Association Gold Medal for International Affairs and the National Magazine Award for Iran reportage, and the Overseas Peace Club Award for her coverage of African wars. She's also authored 8 books, and I could go into more things if we had time. At the moment, she did produce an article a couple of hours ago from the New Yorker, and it's of course very interesting and is perfect for the third presentation, because our first 2 speakers have talked about the big picture she has had an article which deals with recent, past and recent problems, which United States or Israel do very well, and then it falls apart. I remember when I talked to an Israelite about almost 2 decades ago. Israel was again in such a situation, not as big as this, but still, and it was doing great. And I said to an Israeli, "You guys better stop, because this is not going to last." No, we're doing great. Americans are behind us. And by the end, they had a lot of problems. And that's the problems that the Israelis face. Americans are sending people very high level to both Israel and the North to try to stop all this. Let's see what they can do, and let's see what Robin has to say in this very difficult time for her. I don't know how she got this article out on schedule, despite all the problems she's having with that computer, apparently.
Thank you, Steve. I'm always delighted to have conversations with you and to be part of CMED. It's a fixture in my life, and I'm so happy to be with you. Let me say a couple of things about Iran first and play off what both Bijan and Matt have said. I happen to have seen President Pezeshkian twice last month when he was at the UN General Assembly. And I asked him specifically about what his intentions were kind of in dealing with foreign policy, dealing with the West, and the United States. And this is where one of the first times, then having only been in power a month, he made an overture to the West to engage on nuclear diplomacy, to provide Iran in turn economic benefits or greater economic freedom, or the lifting of sanctions that have crippled Iran's economy. And it was quite striking. But I think Bijan is right. The question is this just a honeymoon? And we've seen that play out over and over with whether it's President Khatami from 1997 to 2005, or President Rouhani, who preceded, the President Raisi. So we have now 3 different waves of moderates or reformers, and each one of them has eventually been either sidelined, marginalized, silenced by the kind of hardliners within the system, that their efforts to open up, to reform both society and to deal with the outside world have been blocked in the end, with the exception of the nuclear deal. And of course, then the United States walked away from that. I think Pezeshkian is interesting because he is very committed to the idea of an Islamic Republic. He has repeatedly vowed allegiance to the supreme leader, and the very idea of a Velayati Faqih, a supreme leader, to oversee all political life in Iran. But I think Pezeshkian has recognized, like some of his predecessors, that Iran needs to survive, first as an Islamic Republic, but also for its ideology. And the only way it can do that, given the age of the current supreme leader, who is in his mid-80s, is to deal with the kind of economic realpolitik. And so his overtures should be seen in that context. Iran wants something in exchange. But the real danger is that this honeymoon is short-lived, given the tensions between Iran and Israel, and that these initiatives, or this overture, is muted by what's happening on the ground. I've been doing Iran now for 51 years, and in the Middle East for just as long. And there's a saying that events on the ground always overtake diplomacy. And, I think that that's potential right now, whether it's, Iran trying to deal with the outside world, or the United States trying to bring some kind of peace process back to the Arab-Israeli conflict. But I have a feeling that also because this has been tried so often in Iran, that it's a little bit too little, too late, and that whatever the commitment by President Pezeshkian to try to unite the government, to try to get it back on track with the outside world, that he will find it very difficult because of domestic politics and because of regional politics, not to mention the role of the United States. So the one kind of parallel I would point out is that in 2003, as the United States had forced out the Taliban in Afghanistan and ousted Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the Iranians were feeling deeply pressured, fearing that Iran would be next. And as a result, it engaged in some diplomacy on its nuclear program. Now, we are again at this point where the United States is playing a key role in another conflict where Israel is taking out both, 8 leaders in recent months, 4 from Hamas and 4 from Hezbollah. And these are from groups that had provided the so-called forward defense strategy for Iran. And Iran at the moment is going to be feeling extremely vulnerable, particularly when you remember that Ismail Haniyeh, who is the political leader of Hamas, was assassinated in Tehran in the building where he was staying with a very precise weapon on the same day that President Pezeshkian was inaugurated. I mean, that's just kind of astounding. And it's an intelligence failure, it's a military failure, security failure for Iran. So it's going to be feeling very vulnerable now. But, this is where we get into the dynamics that we talk a lot about the specifics of the moment, Israel versus Iran, when in fact we're talking about what's been a half century of tensions between, the Islamic Republic and not quite, it's 45 years of tensions between the Islamic Republic and Israel. And I think this is not going to end either by taking out the leadership of 2 of Iran's most important allies in Hezbollah and Hamas. So Iran will be worried about how can it ensure its survival? How can it ensure its ideology at a time that its movements are not just militarily decapitated at the top, but not able necessarily to provide the social services, either in Lebanon or Gaza, can't provide the payments. Israel has made clear over the past few days it's going to take out next Hezbollah's financial networks. So Iran will be feeling very, very vulnerable. Now, I'll just say one last thing before I turn it back to Steve, and that is there's a long record dating back, through the last 4 presidents of the United States eliminating top leaders. We killed Abu Musab Zarqawi, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda of Iraq in 2006. And in fact, his movement faded for a while, but the remnants came back as ISIS and took over a third of both Iraq and Syria and ruled 8 million people for 5 years. So there's a lesson there that you can kill a movement, but they regenerate. And the same thing was true in 2010, when finally, after a decade, the United States identified where Osama bin Laden was, and the US, in a daring military operation, assassinated him. But today, the Taliban is back in power, and it is once again aiding and abetting Al-Qaeda, and there are now 8 training camps and 5 madrasas run by Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So, we're getting to a point where there's a pattern. Again, I'll just briefly say Baghdadi was the leader of ISIS, we killed in 2019. And today the intelligence assessment is that its franchises are now blossoming in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia. The United States killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard elite foreign military arm, in 2020. And yet today, the U.S. intelligence estimate issued this year is that Iran and its network will not disappear even after the Gaza war. So there are a lot of lessons in terms of what's happened recently, but also kind of the trend lines, what's at stake for Iran, as we kind of look at how this plays out in the next few days or weeks. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Robin. Many of our leaders in these programs want to have a discussion at that point. But we have several very interesting questions that we'll all be waiting for. And because Robin Wright has to leave at the top of the hour, what I'm going to do now is take questions that I think she might be most interested in. And then at the top of the hour, I'll deal with many other questions, but several of them deal with our two other speakers. So let's begin here, and we have a question from Don Lovett of Canada. Netanyahu wants a conflict and will do what he can to engage Iran to force the U.S. into a conflict. Please comment. Do any of the three of you want to get in on this? And I always remind you, some of you may not want to get into certain questions, but the one I most expected was Robin. Robin, you're on.
Yeah, I do think that Prime Minister Netanyahu does have a broader goal, and it's not just to eliminate the leadership of Hamas and Hamas and Hezbollah. He really has a broader goal, as he said, to create kind of a different regional order. And he's trying to get the United States, I think, to play a more visible or active role, which in fact the United States has since October 7th, in deploying warships, deploying weaponry, taking on some of the Iranian allies in Iraq and Syria, as well as in Yemen. I do think that there is a real danger that the Israelis won't stop, that they may overreach, and as a result get into not just a strike on Iran, but the Iranians have already talked about their planning retaliatory strike on Israel. And the danger is that we get into more of a rhythm or momentum of tit for tat exchanges that don't play out over weeks, but play out over days. And again, this is where we don't know from President Netanyahu what his plan is for Gaza, what his plan is or his goal is in Lebanon, and what he wants to achieve in Iran. Is this regime change? Does he want to take out their nuclear program? This is, again, where, because there's not a vision, we could get in the same trap the United States did in Iraq and Afghanistan, that there was kind of no exit plan and kind of we had a broad goal and principle, but not a plan specifically how this ends. And I think as a result, because we're kind of in an open-ended conflict now that keeps escalating. So I think that's a very good question that your friend in Canada has asked.
Thank you. By the way, the Robin Wright article that was available today, we have at our webinar chat section. So some of you might be quite interested. Bijan, you want to say a word or two?
I just wanted to add a couple of sentences. I agree with Robin, but I think my assumption is that Prime Minister Netanyahu wants Iran to collapse as a state. It's very important to understand, in my view, the assessment or the assumption that any type of regime in Iran if Iran stays this large united country, will be a challenge, a security challenge to Israel. And Israel's ideal scenario would be to collapse the state of Iran, to break it down into different states. And that is obviously an undertaking that Israel cannot do on its own. And that is why it's important for Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli government to drag the Americans into this. And that will then create obviously a very, very ugly regional war. And I hope that it doesn't happen. But I just wanted to make sure that for those diaspora Iranians who think that if Israel attacks Iran, the future of Iran would be nice and we will have a monarchy again, a pro-Israeli, pro-American country. I don't think that will happen. The intention is something completely different, and the best scenario would be for it not to happen, not to get to that stage.
You know, I was talking to an Israeli the other day, and this fellow said, no, it's not going to be, and this guy is the guy who loves war. Not going to be through war. It's going to be, the way we change the government is to end as much as possible any kinds of food or attachment from outside the country. So as long as it gets weaker and weaker, then it will fall apart. Matt's about to talk, but if you have a minute here, do you have something you want to add?
It sounds very similar to what the Trump administration tried to achieve with maximum pressure. And we can just look at that, and whether that was successful, then we can assume that Iran is much more resourceful than many believe. And a type of pressure like this will also mobilize a lot of regional powers and Iranian diaspora not to allow Iran to collapse as a state, in my view.
Okay, Matt?
Yes, no, I didn't have much to add, but I think this question of whether Israel is pursuing regime change strategy, I'm sure is factoring into calculations in Tehran and elsewhere. Of course, the main caveat is, Iranian regime change is not the policy of the Biden administration. I don't expect it to be the policy of the Harris administration. And it was not, I have not seen any change from President Trump that would be his policy either. So I think it's going to be, very interesting if the tension that could occur, of course, between Israel and the U.S. on this particular issue, that is indeed the policy. But again, I'm not sure what, because I can't speak for the Israelis. I'm not sure what's going on when it comes to determining, how far they're willing to push this current campaign. But certainly all of us would like to see a change in policy from the current Iranian leadership, and that could imply many things. But I think that there is certainly the willingness for Israel to push things further, and how the U.S. Will support that are certainly big questions that should be factoring into Tehran's calculations right now.
Let me move on. Another question that seems Robin Wright would be interested in, not to mention the other two, but since she's leaving. Dr. Hussein Tajuddin from Morocco asks, is there any risk that a future war between Israel and Iran could be escalated to a direct confrontation with US and NATO? How about the possibility of a third party, in particular North Korea and Russia? Isn't that the start of a third world war? Anybody want to come in on this?
I'm happy to do that. Yes, I mean, there's a real danger of an escalation that draws in the United States. You have to remember that when Iran unleashed the first round of missiles and drones, the United States and its European allies, and I think some in the region as well, were responsible for taking down more than half of them. And that's the United States is an active player in this conflict already, but only defensively. And I think the question is, do they ever get into an offensive role? Now, it has effectively in Yemen, where the United States in the last week has dispatched B-2s, stealth bombers, to take out Houthi positions in Yemen. The United States has, kind of lost in the chaos of what's happening between Israel and along its borders. Little noticed is the fact the United States has taken out positions by both Iran-backed allies and ISIS in Syria and Iraq that were threatening U.S. forces. So there is that danger of the tripwire, not because the United States wants to get involved, but because it will. Now, I do not think NATO plays a role. This is where NATO learned a lesson in Afghanistan, which was its first commitment outside of European territory. And that didn't turn out so well after 20 years. And NATO was the official command unit for the U.S. dominant military presence there. So I don't see any role for NATO. I do see the U.S. kind of being sucked in more and more defensively to protect Israel. And the question is, does it trip into something bigger? And Matt may be particularly interesting on this question.
Any other comments? Let me actually ask another question related to this from Jaraji J. Angulo from UCLA, I believe UCLA, at least Los Angeles. I don't understand the Iranian hatred toward Israel. Can someone explain why this hatred exists? So you have two questions here that you can play with, and I don't know whether Robin wants to add anything. Bijan?
No, I agree with Robin's answer to the earlier question. And this question actually requires a full briefing over 90 minutes, why Iran is so antagonistic towards Israel. But there are really multiple aspects, and we won't have time for me to go into that. But the one reality that many people forget is that a lot of the revolutionary leaders of the Iranian Revolution in the 70s, those who were sent into exile, they actually lived in Lebanon of the 1970s, when a lot of the Palestinian refugees were also based in Lebanon. And a lot of things we are seeing, a lot of Israeli crimes that we are seeing today, because there is live television and there is social media and so on, these leaders actually saw life in Lebanon. The atrocities of Israelis against Palestinians and against the Lebanese in the 1970s. So the seed was already there for a certain degree of hatred, but obviously there are other layers that have been added. I think today, the best description of the competition between Iran and Israel is a strategic competition between two powers who both want to be the number one power of the region. Obviously, you cannot have two number one powers, and that's why you try to undermine the other power that wants to occupy the number one position, and that turns into a confrontation. And whether we like it or not, even without a military exchange between Iran and Israel, there is a war going on, both through cybersecurity, assassinations, proxies, and so on. So the confrontation is real. What we are hoping here is that it does not go into a hot military confrontation, but essentially it's a competition between two powers who want to be the number one regional power.
Thank you. Now, I want to give I want to give a quick chance for Robin to conclude, but I have one last question that I think might be for her. And it's from another UCLA person. I'm probably going to have a hard time giving the name, Baruch Badvi, a UCLA graduate student. With the recent killings of Ismail Haniyeh on Iranian oil, Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, and Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, how do you anticipate Iran's proxy support and strategy to change in the medium and long-term future? Tough question. And Robin, are you ready to try something?
I am indeed. I actually think that Iran will continue to support its allies. I mean, this is its whole strategy and has been defense strategy, a national defense strategy, and has been since the 1979 revolution. One of the things that one of my favorite quotes in the piece I wrote for the New Yorker comes from Ryan Crocker, who was the US ambassador to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kuwait. And he warned that defeat can only be defined by the party that is ostensibly defeated, not by the presumed victor. If one feels defeated, one is defeated. If not, one fights on. And I suspect Iran will do what it can. The question is, how does it get weapons to Hezbollah? How does it get weapons to the Houthis? What does it do for the Iraqi militias, including Kataib Hezbollah? Much more difficult, of course, is what does it do for Gaza, which is, unlikely to get anything in the way of arms to Hamas. But I think it's that I don't think we should anticipate any major change. It's more its capabilities than it is its commitment when it comes to what it wants to do for its allies. And when we look at the, down the road, and this is where Matt's right, that this tension is going to continue to play out. I think Bijan said this too, that there's nothing that is going to kind of stop it right now, except, this is where diplomacy is the only way out. Wars always stop only when there's a diplomatic off-ramp and there's a diplomatic conclusion. And this is where we don't see either. And Iran doesn't feel much incentive to stop providing weaponry and financial support to Hezbollah. I mean, that's reflected. Bijan pointed out that the Iranian foreign minister had gone to Bahrain and someplace else in the Gulf. But on Saturday, he also was in Istanbul, where he met leaders of Hamas, including one potential successor to Sinwar. So I think Iran sends multiple signals. It wants to better relations with the Gulf countries, its neighbors, and that's been a policy under both hardliners and moderates in recent years. But it also, I think, by meeting with Hamas, is sending a strong signal that it intends to continue.
I want to give the other two a chance if they're interested in answering this question, but since we only have 5 minutes to have you in the program, is there anything else you'd like to mention or tell anyone or comment on? And I've emphasized so far the questions to you. The other two are about to have several other questions, but any last minute thoughts?
So I think we're into a moment, one of those everyone talks about, is this an inflection point and so forth. I want to warn those who feel that, and Israel has a right to feel a little bit heady militarily in the last few weeks, because after the war in Gaza dragged on for more than a year, and the kind of shadow war with Hezbollah has gone on for decades. But there's a real danger in the sense of triumphalism, that this means that they're going to be able to, decimate or annihilate, as one Israeli official said, its opposition. I think is a pipe dream, and I think this is where we all need to be a little bit less breathless in looking at what's happening on a day-to-day basis and try to think kind of big picture, long term, how this plays out. And that's where we get into kind of a much less triumphant moment and a much more sobering reality about, how do we get beyond this? What are the solutions? And I think the problem is there's nothing visible or viable at the moment, including Secretary Blinken's trip to the Middle East. So good luck to everybody. And thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you for coming when you've had such a difficult time the last few days. Matt, do you want to get in on this? Please.
Yeah, just a couple thoughts on this. What's been really fascinating in the past year, is watching Iran recalibrate how it's using its conventional and unconventional power in response to these the broader escalation that's happened since October 7th. And we saw a new kind of threshold of use in April, and then a further one in October that is much more focused on Iran's missile and drone power, and really the led by IRGC Aerospace Commander Hajizadeh, that the real kind of almost dominance of that side of the IRGC, as opposed to really what the Quds Force and Ismail Haniyeh has been doing. I'm not so much saying there's like a upper hand, a struggle happening within the IRGC, but I do think that there is a broader re-estimation of their conventional capacity and what that means for how they want to use the axis of resistance in the future. And I think this elimination of so many key leaders, not to say that there are the others lower in the ranks that can rise up, and I'm sure we'll see some of that. That you don't simply eliminate groups by decapitation, but it so many eliminations is going to probably change a bit of the nature. And as Bijan and Robin have pointed out, sometimes that evolution of these groups after major leadership hits, they can become more over time, more virulent, more aggressive. They can also kind of go and retreat for a long period of time, or they can really kind of reform into something else. We've seen that with ISIS and Al Qaeda, for example. These were somewhat different groups, they're not state sponsored, but you've seen a kind of real death of the classic bin Laden type of Al Qaeda, but a reemergence of different types in Africa and elsewhere. And so the character of these groups can change a bit, and so that's the reason why it really is a lot of unknowns about how Iran is going to balance its conventional forces, particularly its missile and its drone forces, with its projection of power through partners, allies, and proxies. And so I think there is going to be a reevaluation of that, and I don't know exactly how that's going to turn out, but that's the reason why I'm hesitant to say that we know how this war is going to evolve, and how these groups are going to evolve, because I think we are in a different phase of this long-term Iran-Israel calculation, that we're never going to return to the status quo ante that we had before October 7th last year.
Bijan, you want to get on, or should we move on?
Just a couple of sentences. I think Matt summarized that very well. There are a lot of unknowns, but there is one known that we should take into account, and that is that there will be a much larger number of recruits coming from the different countries, both Palestinians, Lebanese, but also regional countries, which also is a factor in Iran's calculations. And I could see the emergence of a larger number of organizations. You don't have to have only one Hezbollah or one Hashd Sha'bi. I can imagine that a number of new organizations with new recruits will emerge.
All right. I'm trying to, we have many questions left, and let me come to some of our early questions. Johnny Joseph of Los Angeles asks, in the recently published book, Palestine 1936, a prominent Arab leader is quoted as saying, "We would rather starve than share a loaf of bread with the Jews," in response to the proposed partisan plan. Does that sentiment still prevail amongst the current Arab regional leadership, and how could it have been affected by the events over the last year? And I have another question that is somewhat similar from Jonathan Gartner of the United States. I wonder if Mr. Abu Sada can think of another way for Palestine to go back on the radar screen than, as he said, October 7th happened. At any rate, those are two questions, and I give both of you a chance to answer them. Either one of you?
First of all, I think a lot has changed since 1936, and you know, Arab leaders, Arab perceptions, regional realities, and so on have changed dramatically, and we have to try to understand what's happening today. But what we can say with certainty is that Israeli actions over the past 12 months have deepened the tensions, the suspicions, the divide between the Israeli population or the Israeli government and the rest of the region, and those level of tensions, that dimension of regional tensions will definitely have to be taken into account in any type of new realities that will emerge in the region. On the second question, I'm certainly not the expert, and I'm not going to comment. I'll stop here.
Matt, do you want to go on? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, not much to add there. You know, I certainly don't represent or can convey fully the concerns of the Arab populations and Arab states. I do think that there is going to be certainly continuing discussions as the war drags on between leaderships in Arab states and really domestic sentiment. I mean, that's certainly nothing new. We've had that for a very long time, that those are not always aligned. And I think the war in Israel has further exposed that. But I think that it's still really uncertain, what the end state of all this is. And whether there is an ability for Israel and its Arab neighbors and even Iran to some degree, come to some new understanding of how things are going to be managed in the region. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, let me have a question from an old friend, Antonia Dimiu, who is at the Institute for Security and Defense Analysis in Athens, Greece. President Pezeshkian, a balanced approach between moderate and conservative factions within Iran immediately after his election was underscored by Bijan. How likely is it for the Iranian president to also balance domestic priorities with complex international relationships, including with the U.S., for a new round of talks on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, or on removing sanctions? Either one of you want to try
Yes,
this?
thank you. Without the current Israeli, Iranian, or Israeli regional tensions, it would have been quite likely. President Pezeshkian did not only talk about it, he sort of also, in my view, convinced a number of other players to pave the way for a new round of talks with Western governments, especially the US, to revive the nuclear sort of agreement, not necessarily to revive the same JCPOA that the parties signed in 2015, because it's just the realities on the ground have changed dramatically, but to use the same structure to introduce certain limitations on the Iranian nuclear program in return for the lifting of sanctions and economic opportunities for Iran. But with the current level of tensions, it is extremely difficult to see that, especially, as Robin said, because the US, one way or the other, is party on the side of Israel in this confrontation. If we do achieve in the region, if we do achieve a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon and some sort of de-escalation, then it's quite likely the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, in one of his speeches, he said, and he was clearly referring to this opportunity, he said it is quite okay to have a tactical retreat. Iran's tactical retreat could be, it is okay to go and negotiate with the Americans to redefine a new framework that could allow Iran to sign a new nuclear agreement. But this won't happen as long as the current tensions and the potential for a regional escalation is real. And for now, we know that it's real. But so we need a de-escalation first in the region, and then potentially a new track of talks between Iran and the US. Obviously, the outcome of the November elections in the US will also be very important.
Matt, you want to come in, or should we go to the next one? I guess
Go to the next one. I'll probably come back to this topic by the
Okay.
end. Yeah.
Now I have two questions from old friends. Again, from Antonia Deriu of the Institute for Security and Defense Analyses in Athens agrees. To what extent is uncertainty on the outcome of the upcoming U.S. elections restraining U.S. involvement in the de-escalation efforts underway in the Middle East? And what should we expect if a Democratic or Republican president is elected? And next, from Peggy McKerney at UCLA, a question to all panelists. Is the current U.S. administration willing to restrain Israel's military actions against Iran, not to mention its actions in Lebanon and Gaza? If the U.S. is unwilling or incapable of doing so, what forces could constrain Israel's military actions? Either one of you want to take this on first? Matt.
Yes. Yeah. I figure this will go to me. And again, reminder, I do not speak for the current administration or any future administrations that may come in after January. But I do think that, the uncertainty and as you know, there's plenty of uncertainty here in the U.S. as well about what's going to happen in the election next month, that, it is inevitably these types of questions are going to, in some ways, either restrain or frankly, unrestrain certain actors, because you do want to think about what do you need to accomplish before a new administration comes in. Obviously, there may be some very distinct differences if it's a Democratic or a Republican, but other things may be pretty straight forward that you want to have the strongest position you can before the new team arrives. So I can see, frankly, both Israel and Iran thinking through that and anticipating that they both need to be in a better position before January, and that is almost certainly affecting both sides' calculations. Now, at the same time, any administration at the end is the U.S. administration. There are certain things that the lame duck period that occurs between November and January can be a period of either inaction or actually a lot of rapid action on the diplomatic front, depending on which team is coming in. And so the U.S. can also try, the Biden administration may also want to try to consolidate certain gains and really accelerate certain activities. So we could see a lot of activity in among the three parties here. during the three main parties here during the November through January period. Or we could see, really a kind of a stalemate of really no progress at all as each side kind of positions and games for the next stage. You also have a dynamic where, that because both potential future presidents are well known within the current system. Obviously, Vice President Harris is currently in the current administration. President Trump was previously president. That there is a lot of connectivity, and both, in thinking as well as, the understanding among the key players about some of the dynamics that will happen if either is elected. There's probably a certain familiarity of individuals and staffing, so there could be a lot as opposed to someone that really brand new coming in. I think both the Iranian leadership and the Israeli leadership understand that, and I think that's going to, I think, encourage a lot of thinking about how to manage this and how to frankly take advantage of those relationships. And so I think that's a main driver there. Whether we see dramatic breakthroughs after January, I don't know, because I think both sides are going to be, whether it's a President Harris or President Trump, there's going to be a desire to establish the new team, establish bona fides about what they're going to be serious about in their foreign policy. This was a challenge, certainly I can say, for the Biden administration when they came in, that people have argued there were opportunities for major, diplomatic moves in those early months in 21 that folks have criticized the Biden administration not taking advantage of. I think part of this is a dynamic that you should expect with even with a lot of the same existing players or players that were previously in office before 21. Even if they're coming back in, it takes a while for U.S. administration to settle in. So my expectation is that there's going to be a lot of uncertainty in those early months of 2025 that we're going to have to navigate through. And so I think the idea that there's going to be major breakthroughs early on, I think we have to be very cautious about that. And I certainly, think that, President Trump on the campaign trail has on the same time been clear that, he's willing to push hard on Iran, but also that he's looking for potential deals if they make sense. And certainly we see the continued diplomatic efforts by the Biden administration are likely the flavor of what we will likely get from a Harris administration. So again, it'll be kind of, my expectation is kind of rough going a bit, regardless of who wins in the early part of 25, but maybe by the later part of next year, we'll have some more clarity of where we could go.
Okay, let's hear from
just a couple of sentences. I agree with Matt. It's very uncertain, but one factor that played a big role in the U.S. exit from the JCPOA in 2017, 2018, which doesn't exist anymore in that form, was the sort of tensions between Iran and the GCC countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on, which obviously both UAE and Saudi Arabia were in favor of ending the JCPOA and creating a strategic distance between Iran and the US. Whereas today we have a situation where Iran and Saudi Arabia have signed an agreement to, definitely a rapprochement process, and Iran has much better relations with the regional powers. And that will also be a factor that can actually facilitate a process of engagement, and which I would not underestimate that impact, especially because some of the GCC members, especially Oman and Qatar, have played a great role as a mediator between Iran and the US. So there could be new components that will pave the way for de-escalation, but I agree it's uncertain and it will take time.
All right, from Moha Enaji, an old friend in Morocco. And a question for Matthew. Since all countries in the region want peace, why don't they stop this bloody war and stop the escalation, which will be devastating for the region and the world? How much power does the U.S. still have to convince Israel for a ceasefire?
Well, certainly the U.S. is still committed to the defense of Israel. We do not want to see, the further escalation into regional conflict. At the same time, we recognize many of the individuals that Israel has targeted recently, in particular, are certainly terrorists from us, particularly legally as well as philosophically and morally, and so. We recognize that in Israel's right to self-defense, that addressing the leadership of these organizations is certainly is understandable. Again, I'm not speaking for the current administration here, but I do think that there is a recognition, the reason why you have not seen, you're not seeing criticism about the recent, in fact, in many ways, certainly for the killing of Sinwar in the past week, real praise from the White House for being able to eliminate the same thing with Nasrallah. So I think that aspect of what is happening is where I think the U.S. is fully supporting. I think certainly the U.S. wants to see an ending to the conflict as soon as it can. At the same time, we are going to continue to defend Israel's right to self-defense, and that obviously is a very challenging task given the threats that Israel sees right now. Obviously, we're working with our Arab partners as well to think through where to get to the right end state here. I think that's going to continue to be, as Bijan says, even from, yes, it's from the Iranian side, but also from the U.S. side, our Arab partners are going to be essential to that conversation. So my hope is with that dialogue being an important part of how we come to a better ending of this situation.
Well, we've only got about 10 minutes left, and I discovered that there are more questions that come in. So what I'm going to try to do is have one person answer each of these left and try to do it quickly. From Johnny Joseph of Los Angeles Jewish community member, any thoughts on Israel's delay responding to the last Iranian strike? And then moves on to ask, any thoughts on Yemen's promise to provide 400,000 troops to support Iran in a war with Israel? So I guess this is for Matt, although Bijan, if you want to get in, please.
Steve, can you repeat that first question?
Any thoughts on Israel's delay responding to the last Iranian strike?
Yeah, it's interesting, and again, I'm not privy to the calculations there, but, we've seen this cycle this year where the expected responses from either side are oftentimes, also being shaped by a lot of political and diplomatic engagements that are also happening. And it's one of the things that I know many analysts, for example, were expecting an Iranian retaliation immediately, within a week or so after Haniyeh was killed at the end of August. End of July and into August, and that obviously didn't happen until we saw the October 1st, and that was of course tied to after Nasrallah's killing. So there is these calculations about how fast each side responds to. This has been as an academic, it's a very fascinating story from an escalation and retaliation and deterrence. But I think it reminds that that it's very difficult to understand all the factors going into these decisions. And I think Israel is taking its time to figure out exactly what type of response is going to have the most effect. And I think that is also factoring into how it's reading Iranian responses. And even after its own strike on October 1st, and in particular, looking at the kind of the internal questioning that's going on inside Iran of the fears of how the Iranian leadership, how penetrated they are, and how vulnerable they seem to be. The same thing within the Hezbollah leadership. This has been a huge story of how both sides, and of course we're hearing other stories about how certain Iranian spying activities going on in Israel have been out in the press recently. But the story about how everyone is potentially penetrated, but really how effective Israeli intelligence has been is becoming very dominant, and I think that's driving some of the calculations on both sides about the how much of that is having its own deterrent effect, its own ability to kind of disrupt leadership, and then what type of response Israel should take at this point that will have the greatest effect. I will say on the Yemen issue, I doubt, the number seems very, very large, even though, Yemen has certainly a respectable population size, compared to others in the region. And this seems outlandish in general, but of course, we're also dealing with the crazy stories these days of, the North Koreans sending troops into Ukraine. And so we're in this kind of a very strange world right now that perhaps even feels a bit more like the Cold War, even World War II, where we're having these kind of large movements of forces across borders. I don't know if we're really heading into this kind of new alignment where we have kind of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Increasingly, we do know that they're working together very closely these days on a number of issues. But this type of collective security among them, and if we bring Yemen into that equation, that could be obviously that's not a very good thing for the U.S. and our partners and allies. But I do think it further drives, in my opinion, cooperation among other states to be able to push back against that. And you're seeing these types of moves, for example, by North Korea, or if Yemen gets involved as well, that's going to push regional states, European, Asian allies, and others to work more closely together as well. It's just the natural kind of security dilemma, manifesting. So for me, I'd be perhaps concerned about that. But at the same time, I think it is something that we will be able to take some action and hopefully to prevent.
Thank you. Now I'm going to give the two of you two questions as we come closer and closer to the end. One is from Makaima Abosada from Palestine. How do the Iranians, Americans, and Israelis perceive President Putin's warning to Israel not to attack Iran's nuclear installations? And another from Arlene Feingold, a UCLA retiree. Hezbollah has been attacking Israel for months and has forced the evacuation of a huge amount of people from the north. When Israel responds and tries to put an end to this, suddenly everyone is blaming Israel and accusing it of possibly starting a regional war. Why was there not a bigger effort to pressure Iran months ago to influence Hezbollah to stop? What should Israel do to stop Hezbollah? So which one of you want to start? Go right ahead.
I'll start. If you don't mind, I'll say just one term about the previous two questions that Matt answered very, very well. Part of the war is also a war of narratives. We hear narratives, and we should not believe these narratives. The real events sometimes call for a longer calculation process and reaction process. Now, to these questions, first of all, President Putin's warning is just a reminder, in my view, for all of us to know that obviously there are so many other interests in this conflict, whether it's China or Russia or India. Other powers are going to be affected by a widening of this conflict, and each power will try to prevent a further escalation through such warnings. And I think we should never underestimate the energy related or transportation related and other geopolitical interests that other parties have, and they will also try to influence the process. In terms of what Israel could do, it's very easy. Israel should declare victory and stop the atrocities in Gaza. That will stop Hezbollah, and that will stop a lot of other forces. It's very simple, and Israel is refusing to understand that.
Do you have any comments, Matt?
Not particularly, but I think that Israel needs to do what it needs to do from a self-defense, for its own self-defense. The threat, part of what Iran has been working with groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, and the militia groups in Iraq and elsewhere over the last few decades, is to threaten and to deter, as well as to threaten Israel and to project power and slowly, attempt to close off Israel's strategic space in the region. And so, the fact that Israel is in sometimes even dramatic ways pushing back against that should not be a surprise to anyone. That this has been the Iranian objective for a long time, and Israel is taking even greater risks these days to undermine, disrupt, and roll back that threat. So I don't see in that sense real criticism in principle. Now we can certainly have discussions about is Israel conducting its campaigns the way it needs to? We obviously want Israel to adhere to international law, and to protect civilians to the greatest degree possible, under our conventional understandings of the laws of war. So all of that is still there, and I'm quite sure there's constant discussions about this. But at the same time, this is a situation that Iran has funded and supported and created in the region for so long, that the real significant effort that needs to be taken to push back again is going to be very difficult, and it's going to be very painful. But at the same time, my hope is that what we're seeing is a resetting of the situation in the region that will hopefully prevent future major losses of life moving forward.
Well, we're going to conclude with a question for you, Matt, from Noah El Mekawi from Egypt. What do you think the U.S. position is regarding the increasing rapprochement between Iran and various Arab countries? While we could see this as threatening to Israel's desire to reconfigure the Middle East, what is the U.S. position? Is it aligned with the Israeli vision, or is the U.S. position more nuanced?
I always have to caveat, I do not speak for the U.S. administration here, but I do believe that the relationship that Iran and the Arab states have been developing, the intent for it is to be de-escalatory and to manage crises and escalation, which from a U.S. perspective is always going to, or most times, be a good thing. I think a lot of the expectation that the agreement that was hashed out with some degree of Chinese assistance last year, whether that's going to manifest into something that is sustainable is a real open question. I have a lot of doubts that Iran is going to uphold its part of that bargain, or frankly has frankly not upheld many parts of its bargain, particularly when it comes to maintaining a support for the Houthis and arming them. That was, from my understanding, was part of the deal, and has not happened the way it was intended. So my expectation is that the Arab states generally have their eyes wide open about whether Iran is going to really fulfill its side of these types of agreements and its side of the relationship. At the same time, we are wanting our partners and our allies in the region to take more of a lead in responsibility for their own security, and that's been true in the Biden administration. I certainly know from what I would expect to see from either the Trump or Harris administration, that we are going to continue to put our allies and partners in the lead. That is a philosophy that has been growing, frankly, for several administrations, and so my expectation is that President Trump would also want to, further empower and strengthen the relationships with both Israel and with our Arab partners, for them to be able to manage these security relationships. And if to some degree that those conversations with Iran help facilitate that management, that may be a good thing. At the same time, I do think we all have to be, pretty frank with ourselves about what those types of conversations are trying to achieve.
So we have reached the conclusion. However, I promised both of our speakers left here that they could give a quick conclusion if they wish. So Matt, I guess since your picture is on, do you have anything else to say?
No, I'd say thanks, Steve, for this conversation. It is a really, when you put this together, I really wasn't certain what kind of situation we're going to be in, which of course is the challenge here, that the situation on the ground continues to change. So that makes all of us that watch this region closely, it's very challenging to be able to prognosticate, to see where this is going, because things are moving very quickly. At the same time, I do think that all parties are frankly understanding each other a little bit more, even as difficult as the war is getting, that each other's intent, capabilities, red lines, whether true, we thought we understood some red lines, but a lot of those red lines have been blown past this year, that we understand where the other is a little bit better. So if that is my one silver lining of this terrible conflict that has been unfolding in the last since October 7th, that we are going to come out of this with a more mature understanding of where each other is, even if frankly that's a place that we don't know how to bridge.
Jean?
Thank you. I can actually connect to what Matt said. I think we are witnessing the emergence of a new regional order, and our discussion also showed that this regional order is just very complex. It's not just the regional relationships. It's not only the interests of the, let's say, international powers and regional powers that come into the same pot of interest. It is just complex because of many technological, economic, geopolitical developments. And this complexity actually creates both hope for a certain degree of de-escalation, that everyone will say, okay, it's just too complex. And as Matt says, we know better what the capabilities are, but it also paves the way for an accidental escalation. And that is where I urge everyone to play his or her role in trying to de-escalate this situation. And de-escalation happens through a better understanding of what the other side, what is motivating the other side, what the psychological aspects are. And I'm grateful that dialogues like this take place, where we can basically improve our understanding of the different positions and different psychologies involved in this conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I was going to conclude by saying. I mean, can't get three better speakers. Unbelievable. And two of the three had internal complexities, and yet and none of us knew what was going to happen when we set this weeks ago. And I thought it was just a fantastic presentation. I want to thank the two of you who are still here. I've been asked to join everyone to October 30th, when we'll be discussing Lebanon and Hezbollah, and on November 12th to assess the new U.S. president and the impact on the MENA region. I'm beginning to wonder if on November 12th we're going to know. Anyway, we will see. Both are being shared on the screen right now. If you have not already joined our mailing list, please send us a message at cmed@international.ucla.edu. That's cmed at international.ucla.edu, and you see something right there on what we have here. And so let me say, we hope to see you soon again, and bye for now, and thank you all for remaining with us for this entire wonderful program, even though it deals with so many difficult issues. Thank you all. Bye-bye.